You issue the Great Barrington Declaration again on October 4th, 2020. October 13th, British Secretary of State for Health, Matt Hancock, speaking in the House of Commons. The Great Barrington Declaration is underpinned by two central claims, and both are emphatically false. First, it says that if enough people get COVID, we will reach herd immunity. That is not true. Many infectious diseases never reach herd immunity, such as measles, malaria, AIDS, and flu. And with increasing evidence of reinfection, he's talking about COVID, we should have no confidence that we would ever reach herd immunity to COVID, even if everyone caught it. The second central claim is that we can segregate the old and vulnerable on our way to herd immunity. That simply is not possible. Close quote. Okay, he makes two extremely serious charges against you, and you and your colleagues, Martin Gould of Harvard and Sunita Gupta of Oxford, responded. How?
Well, first of all, he doesn't understand what herd immunity means. Right? So herd immunity...
That actually, take a moment and really lean into herd immunity, because that is a term that even now is getting used again and again and again. And I confess, I don't quite know what it seems to mean different things as different people use it.
Yeah, so I think he's using it as a synonym for zero COVID. COVID's gone away because enough people are infected. COVID is a coronavirus. The other coronaviruses that are in common circulation in human populations produce colds. And they're controlled by herd immunity. They're not always increasing exponentially so that everyone gets it. What happens is they rise and fall with the season. Enough people get it, and what herd immunity means is when one person has the infection, they spread it to one or fewer additional people.
So you don't get an exponential growth.
Right. You see declining cases, for instance.
All right. So when a population achieves herd immunity, it is not immune, entirely immune to said infection. It simply experiences that infection in a relatively minor, don't want to say control, but in a relatively minor way. There isn't exponential growth. That's all it means. Is that correct?
Yeah, it just means that there's not a growth in the number of cases. A new person gets it and they pass it on to one or fewer additional people. So whenever the case counts are coming down, we're in herd immunity in some technical sense. Since this is seasonal, when it's in season, the number of people that need to have immunity to this needs to be very high, because it passes much more easily.
Right.
When it's out of season, you can have a relatively few people with immunity, and you won't see it growing. So herd immunity is not a synonym for zero COVID. I think Hancock, that's the mistake he made there. The other thing about herd immunity with this disease is it was clear in October of that year of 2020, and even more clear now, that if you are infected, you actually gain substantial protection against reinfection. So there was a study that was just released actually recently, but it verifies a whole long line of studies. At 1 year, this is out of Italy, at 1 year after infection, 0.3% are reinfected. So you're infected, you recover from COVID, and within the context of the full year, 3 out of 1,000 get reinfected, and almost always it's less severe than the first time, because your body still remembers how to fight it off.
Now, that's true of viruses in general, isn't it? That subsequent infections tend to be less severe?
I mean, it's true of the coronavirus. I mean, HIV is a different. I mean, there's some.
The 1918 flu.
Yeah.
Each time it returned with less force. Is that roughly correct?
I mean, the flu is a little more complicated.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. That's the layman going off because I don't know enough to stay within the rails here. Okay, so Matt Hancock, the British Secretary of State for Health, who incidentally was forced to resign because he was caught violating the lockdown rules in Britain. He's now the former Secretary of State for Health. It says that if enough people get COVID, we will reach herd immunity. That many infectious diseases never reach herd immunity. So what's in the back of his mind is, it is our job as the government of Britain to free our country altogether of COVID. And you as a professional medical man say, excuse me, Secretary Hancock, that will never happen.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. Now, what about his second claim? I'll read it again. The second central claim of the Great Barrington Declaration, is that we can segregate the old and vulnerable on our way to herd immunity. That is simply not possible. Close quote. You can't protect them, he says.
So this is one of those points that I'm still baffled by. The public health community that I know has all kinds of creative ideas of how to help people in a population be protected against disease. They're very creative generally in thinking of ways to do focused protection for many, many diseases and conditions. The reaction of Matt Hancock is one example of it, of many people in the public health community, was to throw up their hands and say, we can't do it. Now, what they're saying, and what they had in the back of their heads, and you can see it from the policy, was that if we lock down, we will protect the old, we will protect the vulnerable, just by the fact that we've stopped the disease from spreading.
Right.
That's turned out to be catastrophically false. 80% of the deaths in the United States are people over 60. 80% of the deaths are people over 60. We did not protect the vulnerable because we didn't even attempt to protect the vulnerable. Just to give you some sense of how backward it was, we sent people in the early days of the epidemic that were infected with COVID back to nursing homes, who then infected a large number of vulnerable people. Instead of realizing who the vulnerable were and seeking to protect them, that was a scarce resource. We thought hospital beds were the scarce resource. Well, most parts of the country in March, April 2020 went empty, hospital beds.
Right.
There are other strategies we could use. So we could have, we suggested, for instance, like one was, we have older people living alone at home. We said, okay, you can go to grocery stores and we'll give you an hour. But then they're now in community with a whole bunch of other people, even though they're older, potentially passing the disease on.
Right.
We used DoorDash to make sure that people in the laptop class could get food.
You mean under the lockdown?
Yeah.
Right.
Instead, we could have offered free DoorDash to older people. Like it would depend on the community and the living circumstances. But
okay,
it would be a local thing, right?
So Matt Hancock says, "Oh, we can't isolate the vulnerable. We really can't isolate the old." And then tell me if this layman's response is correct. I don't know what the lockdown caused in the United Kingdom, but it was even more severe than most places here. And in this country, it cost trillions of dollars. And the government spent tens of billions printing money and sending it to people who, for a fraction of that cost, surely it would not have been beyond the ken of man to say, everybody 75 and older, you should shelter at home. We're going to deliver food to you. We'll airdrop masks or whatever. They never even tried.
I mean,
Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, we could have just offered those kinds of things. So, for instance, we used hotel rooms to house young homeless people.
Right.
We could have offered it to many people in LA County, for instance, that I know about. There's multi-generational homes. Grandma living with grandson.
Right.
Grandson goes out, says, "Oh, I might have been exposed." We'll offer the hotel room temporarily for the grandma until
the federal government could have booked every room in every Marriott hotel for 6 months at a fraction of the cost that we imposed on ourselves with this lockdown.
Yeah.
So the Matt Hancock argument is, we can't lock down the old, exposed, vulnerable people, but we can lock down the entire society. It makes no sense.
Yeah.
Am I missing something?
No, you're not missing anything. It was a failure of imagination on the part of public health.
Okay.
And it would be a local thing, right? Every single local community has different needs for its elderly, so you would have to do different things in different communities. So local public health would have to play a role. Instead, the public health agencies in developed countries, and certainly the US and the UK, said only lockdown will help.